Angela Merkel making the point today that Germany is the biggest provider of troops to NATO, the second biggest other than the United States. What do you make of the president's comments specifically today about Germany?
Well, I think they're way off the mark. I think while the NATO allies are trying to let Trump think that they're doing what he says, they were already doing it. They started increasing defense back in 2014 after the Russians took over Crimea. And they have been increasing it ever since. And when Trump talks about, 2% of GDP in the United, and then he says even 4%, the United States is at 3.5%, and it's just not for Europe. We have a lot of an awful lot of troops and equipment over in the Pacific. And I think what Trump has done by undermining the feeling among NATO and the support for NATO is given a gift to Putin, because that's exactly what Putin would love to do, is undermine the alliance.
Lawrence, when we're looking at just the statements, purely the way this is playing out, the very open and public criticism coming from President Trump towards those NATO allies, how much of an impact, how much of a long-term impact do you think just that kind of talk alone is going to have?
Well, I think basically what NATO has decided, and I listened to the comments of the Secretary General Stoltenberg, talked about, well, because of you, we started to increase our defense. No, it started in 2014. If that basically makes Trump happy, fine, because nobody other than Trump wants the United States to abandon the alliance. I mean, we get much more out of it than we put in. And this idea that, the NATO Common Defense Fund, we spend about 20% on there. We don't spend 70%. And if you look at what NATO outside the U.S. is spending on defense, it's 5 times more than Russia. So this idea that they're not spending enough is simply not true. But Trump is appealing to his base back in the United States that think the rest of the world takes advantage of us, whether it's trade or military. And this idea that we would spend less, no, he's increasing our defense budget to levels we haven't seen since the Cold War.
How far is the Republican Party, for example, willing to push back against President Trump if he would, for example, cut back on the U.S. funding in NATO, cancel perhaps some of these military exercises that take place there, which is what some in Europe fear?
Well, I think they would push back a great deal because, as you just pointed out, it was 97-2. So that doesn't mean very many Republicans voted against it, voted for Trump. It's not like some of the issues where, for domestic political reasons, they've been going along even though they disagree. No, they would push back dramatically if, in fact, this is what he tried to do, because they recognize that, in fact, this is good for us. And it's good for our security. And the idea, that, for example, during the Cold War, we had over 300,000 troops in Germany. Now we have 30,000. So it's not the idea that we're still doing more than they are. And while it's important symbolically to talk about the percentage of GDP that you spend on defense, the real question is, what do you buy? And I think that's the real issue. And as you're pointed out in the run-up, you got to start worrying about cyber. You got to keep worrying about terrorism. And don't forget, 1,000 NATO troops have died in Afghanistan, and the attack was on the United States, not on Europe.
Lawrence, if we're looking forward, what many of those leaders there in Brussels are concerned about and thinking about is that meeting, that face-to-face between Vladimir Putin and President Trump next week. Nobody knows what Trump is going to do there, but what do you think he should do? What do you think it's important for him to achieve there?
Actually, what he ought to focus on is arms control. We have all the other differences with the Russians, Crimea, what they did in our elections, all of that. But basically, arms control is where he needs to focus, because that's where the real threat from Russia comes. And President Putin has already asked President Trump to extend our most recent arms control agreement called New START for 5 years. And Trump said no because it was negotiated with Obama. No, he ought to take Trump up on that because that limits the number of strategic weapons that the Soviet Union can have, and then say, I'll do that for you. We also need to work on the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, which was negotiated by my boss, President Reagan, with Gorbachev. And, you know, you've been pushing the envelope on that. We need to get everybody back under. That's what he needs to focus on, because that is something both we and the Russians agree is good for both of us. We started this at the height of the Cold War in the Nixon administration.